Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're learning Maseches Yevamos, daf, pei, dalet, starting at a fresh perek. This perek is referred to as perek yesh mutaros because we're going to be discussing back into the world of yibum and chalitza, although today is easy, relatively speaking, of course. And what we're going to be doing is learning a bunch of different permutations about who can marry who, but it's not as sophisticated and complex as it was in the first few prakim. So let's get started. Pei Dalet Amud Aleph. We're going to be learning until about 2/3 of the way down at the two dots, and then we'll stop and pick up again. It's Hashem tomorrow night. The new parak opens. Yesh mutaros leba'alein ve'asuros le'yiv mehen. There are those who are mutter to marry their husbands, and really they're usher to marry their yavam. So let's say Reuven is married to Rachel. That relationship is fine. However, if Reuven were to die, Rachel would have a problematic relationship with Shimon, which would be the yavam. And the opposite is also true. Mutaros le'yiv mehen. There are those who really are mutter to marry their yavam. However, ve'asuros leba'alein, but fundamentally they shouldn't even be married to their own spouse. And the third permutation, third line of the Mishnah, mutaros le'elu le'elu. There are those who are able to marry both their husbands when they're married, and then if he dies, she can even marry the brother. And lastly, ve'asuros le'elu u'le'elu. Now this covers all types of marriages, and we're going to discuss examples of each of these four categories. So on the fourth line of the new parak, the Mishnah says, ve'elu mutaros leba'alein ve'asuros le'yiv mehen. What are examples of women who are obviously allowed to be married to their husband and who certainly should not, had they fallen to yibum, certainly should not marry their brother? His brother. Says the Gemara, number one is Kohen Hedyot Shenosas Almana. We know that a Kohen Hedyot is allowed to marry an Almana. However, if he dies, who's the brother? V'yesh lo ach Kohen Gadol. So this Almana is allowed to marry the husband, but not allowed to marry the Yavam. The husband is a Kohen Hedyot, an Almana can marry a Kohen Hedyot. But if the Kohen Hedyot dies and she falls b'yibum to the brothers, the Kohen Gadol, that's a problem. So this is a great sample of something which is mutter leba'alein v'aser le'yiv mehen. And here's another example: Chalal shenasa kshera. You have a Kohen who's a Chalal and who is allowed to marry a kshera, but then he makes her into a Chalal when they are together, when they're intimate, and then v'yesh lo ach kasher. So a Chalal can marry a kshera, but a chalala cannot marry a kasher. A chalal, a kohen who has lost his kahuna status, is allowed to marry into the Jewish people, but a female chalala, she's not allowed to marry it. So that would be an example again, where it's a mutter leba'alein and asuros le'yiv mehen. Here's a third case. Yisrael shenasa Bas Yisrael, v'yesh lo ach mamzer. Yisrael marries regular marriage, he marries a Bas Yisrael, regular typical marriage, but his brother's a mamzer. For whatever reason, we have to go back earlier in the Masechta and see how we define a mamzer, and therefore the Gemara says it's a problem, and all of these cases are, as mentioned, mutter for the relationship between the woman and her husband, but had she become a Yevama, she'd be usher to the Yavam. And another one, last one in this category, in the new parak, 7-8 lines into the new Mishnah, Mamzer Shenasa Mamzeres, that's mutter, because we know that a Mamzer Amar Achman, a Mamzer Vada, V'lo Mamzer Safek, so she's allowed to marry this Mamzer, but V'yesh lo ach Yisrael. So if the Mamzer is married to a Mamzeres and the Mamzer dies, who does the mamzeres fall to? The brother, but the brother's a regular Yisrael. So again, another case scenario where it's mutter leba'alein. This is the conclusion of this section. Mutaros leba'alein be'asuros le'yiv mehen. All of these are examples of relationships where the woman, in this case, we'll just call her Rachel, where Rachel is allowed to be married to Reuven. It's a mutter marriage, but had it been that Reuven died, she'd be asura to marry the brother Shimon because of some type of complexity, either mamzerus or almana to Kohen Gadol, or all the various cases that we've just learned about. The Mishnah continues almost halfway down, 4 lines before the wide lines. What about the next case of the presentation of our Mishnah? However, there are those who really are only mutter to their yavam. Rachel is only allowed to marry Shimon, and really she should never have been married to her own husband because that relationship should have been usher. What are examples of this? Kohen Gadol, shekidesh es ha'almana. Kohen Gadol is not allowed to do that. If a Kohen Gadol gets engaged, betrothed to a woman who is an almana, and then he dies, v'yesh lo ach Kohen Hedyot. So that's a problem because now she slept with another man. She's married to a Kohen Gadol, which is aser, but really she's muteres to the Kohen Hedyot. That would be allowed. That is allowed, but only shekidesh, if there is no intimacy, because otherwise it would be another problem. So that's an example where it's usher to be married to the husband because the Kohen Gadol can't marry an almana, but if he dies, the Kohen Gadol, then she can then marry the brother, no problem. Here's another case. Kasher, shenasa chalala, that's usher. We said that a halal can marry a kshera, but a kosher cannot marry a halala. So if a kosher cannot marry a halala, that's aser. But v'yesh lo ach halal. So she's a halala. But if the regular brother dies, if the initial husband dies, and the halala falls to a halal, that's mutter. So that's yet another example where it's mutter b'yibum, but aser leba'aleh. In the actual first marriage, Reuven and Rachel really should have been aser. Another case, Yisrael shenasa mamzeres, that's a forbidden relationship. But when the Yisrael dies, v'yesh lo ach mamzer, so the mamzeres falls to a mamzer b'yibum, perfect shidduch, that works out absolutely fine. And lastly, mamzer shenasa bas Yisrael. So this is another case where mamzer marries a bas Yisrael. V'yesh lo ach mi Yisrael. So when he dies, when the mamzer dies and leaves over the bas Yisrael to marry a regular Jewish woman to a regular Jewish man, that's no problem at all. All of these are examples of mutaros leiv mehen be'asuros lebalet. So we've learned two categories. We've learned about marriages that between Reuven and Rachel were ideal, but when Reuven dies, it's usher for Rachel to marry Shimon. And then we've learned where really Reuven and Rachel should never have been married. But if in fact Reuven dies, then it would be great for the Yevama, for Rachel to then marry Shimon. So these are the two categories so far. The second of the wide lines, the Gemara then presents case number 3. Ve'elu asuros le'elu ule'elu. We have a case scenario where Rachel shouldn't have married Reuven, and Rachel also shouldn't marry Shimon in the case that Reuven dies. Kohen gadol shenasa salmana v'yesh lo ach kohen gadol o kohen hedjot. Right, and this is a case of shenasa, so they're married. So in all circumstances, this woman should not have married either of these men. Kasher shenasa chalala, which is aser v'yesh lo ach kasher. Now she's a chalala, she can't marry Reuven, she can't marry Shimon. Yisrael shenasa mamzeres, which is a marriage that's aser, and she's a mamzeres. And then if the husband dies, v'yesh lo ach Yisrael, that she's a mamzeres. She can't marry Shimon. And mamzer shenasa bas Yisrael v'yesh lo ach mamzer. Another case scenario. Asuros le'elu ule'elu. This is iteration number 3 of the 3 types of marriages that we're seeing between a woman and the 2 brothers. And last but not least, ushar kol nashim mutaros leba'aleinu livmehen, without any examples because we don't need any. All case scenarios, that's like your average family, right? Your average family is that Rachel marries Reuven, all is well and good, fantastic. Rahman al-Islam, Reuven dies, Shimon, Yibum, great. Those are all the typical Yibum cases. So we've discussed many of the cases where we can see the different permutations of mutter leba'alein v'aser leiv mehen, aser leba'alein and mutter leiv mehen, and aser le'elu le'elu.
Is the point of the Mishnah cases that are structurally sound, if that's the right word? In other words, it could be aser because it happens to be that Shimon is married to her sister, all the things we learned before.
No, we're learning in a vacuum now. Yeah.
Structurally,
yes, there's
works, right?
I don't know what the word is, structural. I don't know. It's just, the cases are assumed in a vacuum without any complexities. Right. It has to be that way because this Gemara would take forever to learn. Because that's not the reason why we shouldn't have learned it. But correct. Right. Correct. Yeah, just like can a mamzer marry Bas Yisrael? No. Okay, so also the Ba'alein, whatever the case. More simplistic. So simple, right? We don't, the way the Mishnayos were written, we're kind of in a more streamlined, but when you come to Shas, it's like a bit of a funny way to learn it because that's what I remember Yitzbrand has said this many times. That the second parak all about Zika should have been before we start. Nobody knows what Zika is. Yeah, it's like that all the time. That's the hard part about learning. The interconnect, you have to know everything to know anything, which is why we know nothing. That's not depressing at all. So 2/3 of the way down, we're most of the way through the Mishnah. Then we change gears a little bit. Shnios midivrei sofrim. Remember this phrase? Shnios are rabbinic injunctions on certain moments of intimacy. And how does that play with different permutations? Shnia lebal, v'lo shnia liyavam. Let's say that a woman is a shnia lebal. She has a rabbinic injunction against her own husband to be with him, and she has no such restrictions with the yavam. So then asur lebal muteres liyavam. Then if her husband dies, who she should never have been married to, then she's allowed to then marry Shimon, the brother of Reuven, no problem. The reverse, shnia liyavam, v'lo shnia lebal. Let's say that there's an isur derabanan status between Rachel and Shimon, between the yavam and the yavama, but not between Rachel and Reuven. So then asur liyavam umuteres lebal, obviously. Shnia lezeh lezeh, asur lezeh lezeh. Let's say that a woman has rabbinic injunctions against both her husband Reuven and against Reuven's brother Shimon. So then, of course, she should not be married to any of them. And when we say she should not be married to any of them, ein la lo ksuva, v'lo peiros, v'lo mazonos, v'lo belos, v'avlad kosher. She doesn't get ksuba. She doesn't get peiros. We discussed peiros. These are things that are brought into the marriage. Mazonos, her husband is not obligated to sustain her. V'lo belos, belos are clothing. They're clothes that she brought into the marriage that her husband can wear. But the child is considered a kosher because it's only quote unquote a shnia. It's only a din derabanan on the tashma shemitah. We do force them to get divorced because this marriage is not appropriate. The Gemara does qualify that when it comes to almana lekohen gadol, which is an asur marriage, and a grusha v'chalutza lekohen hedjot, and mamzeres v'nesinu l'Yisrael, and bas Yisrael v'nesinu l'mamzer, yesh lahen ksuba. Those cases do have ksuba. So that's just very interesting that all of those cases are d'oraisa. The woman gets a ksuba, but when a woman has a relationship that has nisr d'rabbanan status with someone, then there's no ksuba. Very, very interesting idea. Maybe you could connect the whole thing. A whole injunction of ksuba is based on a din d'rabbanan. That's we should have the writing of the ksuba. We technically don't need a ksuba for a couple to be married. We read it under the chuppah to separate between kedushin and nesuim, but it's be'etzem. Why do we have a ksuba? It's not a din d'oraisa. That is the Mishnah, and we're going to be analyzing. For the next many lines, one word that we had in the Resha. And that question goes like this. My area, Datani Nasa, Lisne Kidesh. It should be that in the first section of our Mishnah, if you look on the fifth line of the Mishnah, it says, Kohen Hedjot Shenasa Salmana, V'yeshlo Ach Kohen Gadol. Why did the case have to be like this? This was a case that was mutter l'ba'alei and v'asr liyivmehen. Why did it have to be a case where a Kohen Hedjot was actually married to an almana? It could have just been that he was only engaged to an almana, and the halacha wouldn't have been any different. So that's the Gemara's question. This is a classical case scenario where we pick on Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's sharpness of language. He did not make any errors when it comes to Mishnayos. So why did he make this case a case where he said that the Kohen Hedjot was married to the almana, when all that would have had to have happened was the more minimalistic case of simply engagement, of betrothal? So it says the Gemara, Lisni Kiddush, back to where we are, 7, 8 lines from the bottom of the page. If you want to say that Taima Dinasa, the reason why the case was about marriage was the Havale Aseh Velo Saseh, that we are talking about a case of an aseh and lo saseh. Aval, had it been kidesh, then asi aseh v'docha lo saseh. That had it only been kidesh, then maybe we could say that the mitzvah of Yibum would have overridden. That can't be. V'hakula pirkin, the whole entire Mishnah is aseh v'lo saseh. Hu v'lo asi aseh v'docha lo saseh. In our Mishnah, for whatever reasons, we're not even engaging with the conversation of aseh docha lo saseh. We had lengthier conversations about this earlier in the Masechta. So says the Gemara, even if you want to say that the reason why Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wrote the word kidesh, wrote the word nasa instead of Kiddush was to avoid a complexity of aseh docha lo saseh. You can't say that because the whole Mishnah deals with aseh and lo, doesn't deal with aseh and lo saseh, and there's other cases of marriage in our Mishnah. Says the Gemara, you're right. And 6 lines from the bottom, the reason why it says nasa in the ratio is because mishum de kabayla misni seifa, because of what we have in the end. In the end, what did we have? We had a case of in our Mishnah, Kohen Gadol shenasa salmana. There we said the Kohen Gadol had to actually marry the almana dafka nasa deshav yechalala. When a Kohen Gadol marries an almana, what makes her into a chalala? It's marriage, it's tash mishamita, it's not betrothal, it's not kiddushin. That case, we needed it to say nasa. Aval kidesh sharyale, had it only been kiddushin, it would not have made her into a chalala. Therefore, tani nami resha nasa. So the reason why it says in the resha on the 5th line of our Mishnah, Kohen Hedjot shenasa salmana, is because later in the Mishnah we had a case of nasa where the word of nasa was dafka. And for all of the symmetrical reasons that we have for Mishnayos, we want the reshas and the seifas to look as equivalent as possible to make them easier to memorize. So therefore, when we see this throughout Shas, that because in the Seifa it says Nasa, so therefore in the Resha it says Nasa, even though logically and halachically the Resha couldn't have said, didn't need to say Nasa, could have said Kiddush. Hold on 1 second. The Tani Mishum Seifa. Once you're going to tell me to look at the Seifa to build symmetry between the Seifa and the Resha, well, you skipped over a lot of other cases in the Mishnah. Listening Mishum Etziyasa. Maybe we should have said that our symmetry should exist between the middle case, the Mitziyasa and the Resha, and not the Seifa and the Resha. Why? What did it say in the middle of our Mishnah? It says, Kohen Gadol She Kidesh Salmana v'yeshlo ach Kohen Hedjot. In that case, we see that it was a case of Kidesh. So if what you're saying is that we need symmetry, and you tried to say that since in the Seifa we need the word Nasa, so then in the Resha we're going to use the word Nasa, why would you do that? Make an equivalence between the middle case of the Brisa, of the Mishnah, the Mitziyasa, and the Resha. And then you can say that since in the Mitziyasa it says Kidesh, then we can leave the Resha Kiddush. It's a beautiful question. The Gemara structurally is asking a great question. Says the Gemara, Ella, you're right. You're right. That's a very good argument. And we couldn't use the classical approach that Mishum that it says in the Seifa Nasa, the Resha, also because we break that rule because the middle of our Mishnah says Kiddush. Says the Gemara, Ella, Mishum Bas Buksa. What is Bas Buksa? So Rashi helps us out with this phrase. Rashi, 2 lines from the bottom, Hachi Garsin al Mishum Bas Buksa. But the Tani Nasa Beresha Bepirkin. The Bereishit Pirkin Mishum Bas Buksa, Klomar Hashanuya Betzida. Bas Buksa is the neighboring statement in the Mishnah. The next statement in the Mishnah is a case of halal. So look back in our Gemara. El Mishum Bas Buksa. The next case in our Mishnah says the Kabbalah the Mishnah halal she nasa kshera taima de nasa de shavya halala. In that case, we needed the word to be marriage because it's the tashmish amita of marriage that turns that woman into a halala. Aval kidei sharyale. But had they only been engaged halachically, then that would not have made her a halala. Mishum hachik tani nasa. And because the second phrase in our Mishnah had to speak about a case of nasa, therefore the Reisha, the Ben Buksa, had to also have the same language of nasa. A very, very sophisticated argument all around one idea, which is why did Rabbi Yehuda Nasi choose that in the fifth line of our Mishnah, in the first case he presents, that it says Kohen Hedjot she nasa salmana.
What's the point? I mean, of this typical non-marriage.
Well, what the Gemara is picking up on is that in the first case that's presented in our Mishnah on line 5, we didn't have to say that they were married. We could have said that they were engaged. And the same exact result of the Mishnah would have been true. Even now we're agreeing to that first case only had to be a case of Kiddushin and not Nisuin. We're agreeing to that. The only reason it's there is because of the next line, which is Nasa. So because the second line was Nasa, the first line was Nasa, even though intellectually and halachically, even if it was Kiddushin, the first case would have also made sense. So we're trying to figure out why Rabbi Yehuda Nasi picked this when everybody knows that there's no reason to write Nasa. He could have had a case of Kiddushin instead of Nisuin. So that's the answer the Gemara gives. Says the Gemara, Umay irya diktani almana lisni besula. Then the Gemara asks a similar style question. And if you look in the case of, which case is it? It's in the Mishnah here. It is the third or fourth case. Let's see. Here you go. Is it Kohen Gadol Shenasa Almana? Kohen Hedjot. Our Mishnah has a case that says Kohen Hedjot Shenasa Almana v'yesho ach Kohen Gadol. So that's the first case of our Mishnah, also on line 5. Sorry about that. Look at line 5 in our Mishnah. Kohen Hedjot Shenasa es Almana. Why does the Kohen Hedjot have to marry an Almana for this case? What happens when the Kohen Hedjot dies? She becomes an Almana. Why does he have to marry an Almana? He can marry anyone he wants. But when he dies, she becomes an Almana, an Asura to his brother. So why does our Mishnah have to say that the case that the Kohen Hedjot married an Almana? That is an irrelevant feature. It's irrelevant. We don't care if she's an almana or not right now, because when he dies, the Kohen Hedjot, what happens to his wife? She becomes an almana. So why did we pick this case of almana? Lisni basula. She could have been a regular virgin, someone who's never been with anyone before, and nothing would have changed in our Mishnah. As we turn to the top of Pei Dalet and the base, the Gemara says something shocking, and Tosfos doesn't understand it. Well, it's hard to even explain. Maybe you'll say, Kasavar Haitana, the author of our Mishnah, looks at a moment in time when we determine as to whether or not this woman can marry the brother, can marry the Yavam. And that moment is Nisuin Harishonim Mapilin. We look at what happened right before her first husband, in this case, the Kohen Hedjot, married her. And there she was not an Almana. There she was a Basula. So if we look at that moment in time to determine whether or not this woman could marry the Kohen Gadol Yavam, okay, then we had to have that case be an almana. But says the Gemara, what are you talking? How can you? First of all, that's just a crazy assumption, because now when the husband dies, when Ruvain dies, Ruvain's a Kohen Hedjot, Rachel is the wife, she's a basula. When Ruvain dies, she becomes an almana. So why would we look at the moment right before they get married? Tosfos asked this question at the top. Tema, Tosfos says, the Kohen Gadol lo amrina b'shum duchta nisuin mapilin. We don't ever say such a thing, that we look back at a strange moment in time that isn't relevant to right now. When Ruvain dies, she becomes an almana. End of conversation. Anyways, Tosfos basically says the question needed to be asked one way or the other about the word almana, even if we didn't use the v'chitema. It's basically saying the v'chitema is kind of like it's just kind of to move things along. What?
It's like a quasi-type state that she is, but she isn't.
Right, and Tosfos is kind of implying that the v'chitema, the recommendation here is kind of like, whatever, I'm just throwing something out there, like almost like a filler. Like, and if you want to say this, that's ridiculous. Yeah, it's ridiculous. We agree it's ridiculous. But the Gemara gives a different response. Even if you want to say that we look at the moment in time when Reuven and Rachel were just about to be married, where she was a basula, we can't say that anyways, because later in our Mishnah, there we said she was a kshera. We said she was a kshera, but when she sleeps with the chalal, she becomes a chalala. So over there, we didn't look at that moment in time. So therefore, the whole idea is rejected on its head. Back to our question. Why then does it say that an almana, why does it say almana in our Mishnah when it doesn't need to say almana? It could have just said a regular basula, because when he dies, she'll become an almana. Says the Gemara, ha vadai mishum seifa. That's for sure. The reason why we say almana in the reisha is because of the seifa. Mishum de kabay lemisna seifa kohen gadol shenosas ha almana v'yesh lo ach kohen gadol o kohen hedjot dafka almana aval basula chazile mishum hachik tani almana. That because in the seifa we had a case that was referenced specifically with almana where we needed almana to be mentioned. Therefore, because it was a kohen gadol marrying that woman, they're only asur to one another if she's an almana. So therefore, the reisha also said the same thing. On Pei Daled Amud Beis, about 7 lines down, where it says Maskif la Rav Papa, the Gemara is going to ask a question. It's no longer on the same theme of picking on words in our Mishnah, but it is recognizing that there is something missing in our Mishnah. There is another iteration of cases that should have been mentioned in our Mishnah that's missing. And it's a case that we've learned before. Let's have a look inside. Maskif la Rav Papa, that there's something missing in our Mishnah. Im Isa, if you want to say as follows, Lahadachi Asa Rav Dimi Amar Rav Yochanan. When Rav Dimi showed up, he had learned Torah from Rav Yochanan. He taught the following. We learned this just a few days ago. Mitzri, we have a Mitzri Sheni, a second generation male Mitzri who's not yet allowed to marry into Klal Yisrael. Shenasa Mitzris Rishona. And he, this second generation Mitzri man, marries a first generation Mitzri woman. Bina Sheni Have, we follow the woman, and the child, because she's generation 1, the child is generation 2. Listening, maybe we should say Nami Mitzri Sheni Shenasa Shte Mitzrios. Maybe we could have taught another case where a Mitzri marries 2 women. Achas Rishona ve'achas Shnia. One of the women is a first generation Mitzris. The other wife is a second generation Mitzris. V'hayulo banim Rishona v'Shnia, and he had a child with each of these women. Inasuv kior chayhu, if they were all married in the right way, then mutaras laba'alehen ve'asuras leiv mehen. Then they'd all be mutter to marry their husband, but they would not be able to marry the Yevamim. The epoch v'nasuv, and if they married the wrong people, mutaras leiv mehen ve'asuras laba'alehen. And as well, mutaras le'elu in a case of giores, and asuras le'elu Ilonios, that if you have a case of a woman who can't have children, that everyone agrees that it's usher to marry. Now, what this Gemara did in 5 lines is it took the case of a Mitzri man marrying a Mitzris woman and made it the same exact cases of permutations in our Mishnah. Mutter leba'alein and usher to yivmehen. Usher leba'alein and mutter to yivmehen. Mutar in both and usher in both. So the Gemara is bothered. Why isn't this case of Mitzri found in our Mishnah? If you given me, what do we see? 10 cases in our Mishnah. Why did you leave this one out? If it's really the same halachos, if this case of the Mitzri marrying a Mitzri, if all the halachos really align with our Mishnah, then there's a blaring omission. Rav Yochanan's case should have been taught. Now, Rav Yochanan was post-Mishnaic era. He didn't live at that time, but still the case should have been there because Rav Yochanan taught it as a brisa. So why is it that this case of the Mitzri and the Mitzri, why is it not brought in our Mishnah? In other words, let's ask the question more broadly. Are the cases in our Mishnah, is the list exhaustive, or is the list just like, okay, here's a few ideas? So let's see. So the Gemara says, a third of the way down on Pei Daled Amud Beis, ton of a shiur. You're right. The case of Mitzri should have been there. It was left out. Now, we have a general rule that when there is something that the Tana left out of a Mishnah, that there's more than one thing that Tana left out of the Mishnah. So therefore, the Gemara says, my shiur dahai shiur. What else was left out from our Mishnah other than this case of Rav Yochanan, the Mitzri and the Mitzris that was left out? Says the Gemara, shiur psuadaka. Psuadaka is asur lavo bekal. So maybe we should have included that in our Mishnah, that in addition to the Mitzri that was left out, we also left out the case of Psuadaka. And if that's true, then all is well and good. Says the Gemara, and that doesn't make sense. You can't say that Psuadaka was left out of our Mishnah because Imishum Psuadaka, Lav Shiura, Tahatana Lechai Lav. And that wasn't left out. It's included just like all other marriages that are referenced in our Mishnah about Chai Lav and about an Isser Deraisa to marry someone, which is Psuadaka. So we don't need the case of Psuadaka because our Mishnah indicates many cases where there are Chai Lavin. Says the Gemara, Atu Chai Lavin Milok Tani V'Hadar Tani. You don't think that there are duplicative cases in our Mishnah where we've already seen the Chai Lavin mentioned once and now we see it again? That can't be. Says the Gemara, V'Aktani Kohen Hedjo Shenasa Almana V'Chalal Shenasa Ksheira. These are 2 different cases where there are Isurei D'Oraisa. So we can see that it was already taught more than once. So maybe Psuah Daka should have been mentioned specifically. No, those cases that you just mentioned, Ahu Itzricha Leila Ashminin Kid Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav, why did we have multiple Isurim mentioned in our Mishnah? Because it was to teach us Lohusiru Ksheros, that there is no Isser of Ksheros Lehinase Lepsulin. A woman who's a Chalala should be able to be married. A woman who is a Kohenes, a kosher Kohenes is allowed to marry a Chalal, like we saw in our Mishnah. Hold on one second. Our Mishnah already said this. Baktani chalal shenasa kshera. And what else did it teach? V'Yisrael shenasa bas Yisrael v'yesh lo ach mamzer. Another case of Isser is mentioned in our Mishnah. So if you want to say that Psuah Daka is bichlal, the general case of Chayvei Lavin, but our Mishnah details many cases of Chayvei Lavin. So why did it have to detail mamzer? Mamzer is another example of Chayvei Lavin. So says the Gemara, almost 2/3 of the way down. Hanami lo mahader misnahi. That's not extra either. Dashmin and lav she'ein shavi b'kol. Some of the lavin that are spoken about in our Mishnah don't apply to all Jews; they only apply to Kohanim. So that's why our Mishnah went out of its way. The kamash malon lav hashavi b'kol. It speaks about mamzerus that applies to Kohanim, Yisraelim, and Levim, and therefore there's still nothing extra in our Mishnah. Says the Gemara, yes, there is. Haktani Yisrael shenasa mamzeres v'yesh lo ach Yisrael, a separate Isser altogether, skipping the parentheses. Elolav, you're absolutely right. Shma mina tana v'shir, that we actually see that there are extra things that were left out of our Mishnah, and therefore the case of Mitzri and the case of Psuah Daka show us that the list in our Mishnah is not exhaustive. There are other cases that could have been applied to our Mishnah. They're just left out, and that's okay. Shma mina, that is in fact true, that the case of Mitzri and Mitzris would fit into the 4 buckets of our Mishnah of mutaros leivmein v'asur leba'alein, mutaros leba'alein v'asur leivmein, mutaros le'elu le'elu v'asuros le'elu u'le'elu. And we'll stop right here at the 2 dots and pick up Emir Hashem tomorrow night with Gufa, wishing you all a beautiful night.
Is it cut one after